The Mediterranean sun has bleached these stones for 3,000 years. The ruins of Troy still whisper if you know how to listen. But what they whisper is not the story you were told in school. It is not the tale of a clever hero outwitting monsters and gods. It is something far darker, a chronicle of atrocity dressed in the language of glory. We have been taught to admire Odysseus. The textbooks call him resourceful. The professors call him cunning. Hollywood calls him a survivor. But there is another word for a man who deceives everyone he meets, who sacrifices his companions for personal gain, who slaughters defenseless people in their sleep. There is a word for a man who takes 10 years to return home, not because the gods opposed him, but because he could not stop making enemies of everyone he encountered. Before we begin this journey into one of ancient Greece's darkest and most unspeakable stories, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is a story that official history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. The ancient Greeks themselves were not unanimous in their praise of Odysseus. The tragedian Sophocles portrayed him as a manipulative schemer. Virgil, writing for Rome, cast him as a villain responsible for Troy's destruction through dishonorable trickery. Even Homer, who gave us the Odyssey, filled its pages with moments so disturbing that modern translations often soften them beyond recognition. Consider what we actually know. Odysseus was a king who abandoned his newborn son and young wife to fight in a war he tried to avoid through feigned madness. When that deception failed, he spent 10 years at Troy perfecting the arts of manipulation, theft, and murder. He conceived the Trojan horse, not a brilliant military strategy, but a war crime that enabled the massacre of sleeping civilians, the enslavement of women and children, and the desecration of sacred temples. Then came the journey home, 10 years of wandering that we attribute to divine punishment and supernatural obstacles. But strip away the mythological veneer, and a different pattern emerges. At every island, every shore, Odysseus made choices that resulted in death. Usually the deaths of others, conveniently never his own. His crew numbered over 600 men when they left Troy. Not one of them reached Ithaca. 600 families destroyed, 600 fathers and sons and brothers who trusted their king to bring them home. And Odysseus alone survived, washing up on his native shore with nothing but the clothes on his back and a talent for deception that had cost everyone around him everything. This is the man we call a hero. The myths tell us that Poseidon cursed him, that monsters devoured his men, that witches enchanted his companions. But myths are told by the survivors, and survivors have reasons to lie. What if the monsters were simply foreign peoples defending their homes? What if the divine punishments were consequences of human cruelty? What if Odysseus crafted these fantastic tales precisely to obscure the truth of what he had done? Tonight, we will read the Odyssey differently. We will follow the blood trail that Homer tried to disguise with poetry. We will listen to the voices of those who could not tell their own stories. The slaughtered Cicones, the blinded shepherd, the devoured sailors, the murdered suitors. We will see Odysseus not as his own propaganda portrayed him, but as his victims experienced him. The truth has waited 3 millennia to be spoken. The stones of Troy have waited long enough. The war was over. Troy had fallen in fire and screaming, its men slaughtered, its women divided among the Greek kings like cattle. Odysseus's ships were loaded with plunder, gold and bronze, and human beings stolen from burning homes. The beaches of the Aegean lay ahead, and beyond them, Ithaca, where Penelope had been waiting for 10 years. But Odysseus did not sail home. The first stop after Troy was the city of Ismarus, home of the Cicones. These people had not fought against the Greeks. They were not enemies. They were simply there, a prosperous coastal settlement with temples and farms and families who had nothing to do with the Trojan War. Odysseus attacked anyway. The assault came without warning, without declaration, without reason beyond greed. His men swept through Ismarus at dawn, killing the men and enslaving the women. They looted the temples, burned the houses, and divided the spoils on the beach. Homer describes this in a single matter-of-fact passage, as though raiding a peaceful city were simply what one does after a war. But here is what Homer does not explain. Why? Odysseus had wealth from Troy. His ships were already heavy with plunder. His men were exhausted from a decade of warfare. Home was within reach. Why stop to massacre innocents? The answer reveals something essential about Odysseus's character. He was not sailing home. He was continuing the war by other means. The habits of violence had become comfortable. The identity of conqueror had replaced whatever he had been before. Ithaca represented responsibility, domesticity, the tedious work of kingship. The sea represented freedom to take what he wanted from those too weak to resist. The Cicones were not weak for long. Survivors fled inland and raised the alarm. By the next morning, a relief force had gathered, Cicones from the hill country, trained warriors who had not been caught sleeping. What followed was a rout. The Greeks, drunk on stolen wine and scattered across the beach, could not form ranks in time. They were driven back to their ships in chaos, leaving 72 men dead on the sand. 72 families who would never see their fathers and sons again. 72 graves that existed only because Odysseus could not resist the urge to raid, to burn, to prove his dominance over people who had never threatened him. And here is the detail that damns Odysseus utterly. When the survivors finally escaped to sea, when the Cicones had been left behind on their bloodied beach, Odysseus blamed his men. He told the story this way for the rest of his life. His men had disobeyed him, he claimed. He had ordered an immediate departure, but they had insisted on staying to feast and drink. Their greed had caused the disaster, not his decision to attack in the first place. This is the pattern we will see again and again. Odysseus makes a choice that leads to catastrophe. Men die because of that choice. And somehow, in the telling, Odysseus emerges as the wise leader whose counsel was ignored by foolish subordinates. The dead cannot contradict him. 72 men lost at Ismarus. The journey had barely begun. 9 days of storm drove the ship south, away from the familiar Aegean into waters no Greek had charted. When the winds finally died, Odysseus found himself on a strange shore where the inhabitants ate flowers that made men forget. The lotus eaters are remembered as one of the gentler encounters in the Odyssey. No violence is recorded, no blood was shed. Odysseus sent scouts inland, and they found a peaceful people who offered them the lotus fruit. The men who ate forgot their mission, forgot their homes, forgot everything except the bliss of the flower. Homer tells us that Odysseus rescued them. He dragged the weeping men back to the ships and tied them beneath the rowing benches until the drug wore off. Then he ordered immediate departure, and the fleet sailed away. This is the story we are supposed to admire. But consider it from another angle. The lotus eaters offered no threat. They practiced no deception. They simply shared their food with strangers, as Mediterranean hospitality demanded. The men who ate the lotus did not die. They did not suffer. They simply chose, in that moment, to stop running. After 10 years of war, after the horrors of Troy, after the massacre at Ismarus, can we blame them? These were men who had seen their friends cut down in battle. They had participated in atrocities that would mark their souls forever. They had followed their king into a raid that killed 72 of their companions for no purpose except greed. And now they found a place where all that pain could simply dissolve, where memory itself could be released like smoke. Odysseus called this enchantment. He called it a trap, a danger, a threat to their homecoming. But was it? Or was it simply peace? A peace that Odysseus could not tolerate because peaceful men do not follow kings into the dark. He dragged them back. He bound them. He forced them to resume a journey that would kill every last one of them. Not one of those men reached Ithaca. We will never know their names. Homer did not consider them important enough to record. They were simply bodies, rowing strength, expendable resources in Odysseus's quest to return home. Their desires, for peace, for rest, for an end to trauma, did not matter. The lotus eaters themselves vanished from history. We know nothing of their fate, whether other Greeks found their island, whether the flower that brought forgetfulness proved their salvation or their doom. They exist only as an obstacle in Odysseus's journey, a temptation he overcame. But perhaps they understood something Odysseus never did. Perhaps they knew that some memories should be forgotten. Perhaps the lotus was not a drug but a mercy, an escape from the unbearable weight of war. Odysseus denied his men that mercy. He would deny them many things before the voyage ended. The island appeared on the horizon at dawn, mountainous, green, filled with bleating goats. Odysseus could have sailed past. His ships had provisions. His course lay elsewhere. But he saw the smoke of cooking fires and the mouths of caves along the shore, and he made a choice that would destroy everything. Curiosity, he would later claim, a desire to know what kind of people lived there. But Odysseus was no ethnographer. He was a king who had just raided one peaceful settlement and would raid others before his journey ended. What he wanted from that island was plunder. He selected 12 men and rowed to shore. They found a cave rich with cheese and penned lambs, obviously belonging to someone who would return. His men begged him to take what they needed and leave. They could see the massive scale of everything in the cave. The stone wheels of cheese as large as shields. The milk pails a man could bathe in. They understood what such size implied about the cave's owner. Odysseus refused. He wanted to meet the inhabitant. He wanted a gift. The concept of guest friendship was sacred in the ancient world. A traveler could expect food and shelter from strangers, and in return would offer gratitude and sometimes presents. Odysseus intended to exploit this custom, to demand hospitality from someone whose home he had already invaded and whose food he was already eating. What happened next has been told as a monster story. The Cyclops Polyphemus returned, sealed the cave with a boulder no ship could move, and discovered the intruders. In his rage at finding strangers consuming his livelihood, he killed and ate several of Odysseus's men. The horror is real. The deaths are real. But consider the sequence of events. Odysseus invaded a home. He consumed food that was not his. He refused to leave when he had the chance. And when confronted by the owner, a shepherd living alone, bothering no one, he expressed indignation that the sacred laws of hospitality were not being observed. Polyphemus was not a monster. He was a herder who lived in isolation, tending his flocks, making his cheese, harming no one who did not first harm him. His crime was responding to home invasion with violence. By that standard, the Cicones who counterattacked at Ismarus were equally monstrous. The blinding that followed was not heroic. It was torture. Odysseus and his surviving men heated a wooden stake until it glowed, then drove it into the eye of a sleeping, drunken host who had been deceived into helplessness. They listened to his screams echoing across the island. They felt his blood spray across their hands. They called this cleverness, and then came the act that damned them all. As the ships pulled away, as safety was within reach, Odysseus could not resist boasting. He shouted his name across the water. He mocked the blinded shepherd. He claimed glory for what he had done. Polyphemus prayed to his father, Poseidon, god of the sea. He asked that Odysseus lose all his companions, that he reach home only after years of suffering, and that he find trouble waiting. Every element of that prayer was fulfilled. 600 men would die because Odysseus could not resist announcing himself, because even in victory, even in escape, he needed his enemy to know who had defeated him. His pride was worth more than the lives of everyone who followed him. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, offered Odysseus a gift that should have ended the journey. He gathered all the contrary winds into a leather bag and gave Odysseus a clear path home. For 9 days the ships sailed with perfect conditions, and on the 10th day Ithaca appeared on the horizon. Odysseus could see the smoke rising from his own hearths, and then he fell asleep. The story blames his men. They had watched their captain guard a mysterious bag for 9 days, never sleeping, never explaining. They assumed it contained treasure he meant to keep for himself. While he slept, they opened it. The winds exploded outward. The ships were driven back across the entire sea to Aeolus's island. When Odysseus begged for help again, the windkeeper refused. A man so cursed by the gods, he said, was not worth helping. This is presented as tragedy, as bad luck, as the betrayal of a good leader by his greedy men. But examine it more carefully. Odysseus had just spent 9 days refusing to sleep, refusing to delegate, refusing to trust anyone with the knowledge of what the bag contained. After 10 years of war and months of disastrous voyaging, after Ismarus and the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclops, he still could not bring himself to share information with the men whose lives depended on it. Leadership requires trust. It requires communication. It requires the understanding that no single person can remain vigilant forever. Odysseus knew the bag's contents were dangerous. He knew his men were suspicious. He knew that exhaustion would eventually overtake him, and yet he told no one. The men who opened that bag were not acting from malice. They were acting from the reasonable assumption that their captain was hoarding wealth while they suffered. In 10 years of following Odysseus, what had they learned except that he looked out for himself first? 72 dead at Ismarus, several eaten in the Cyclops cave, and at every disaster, Odysseus found someone else to blame. Now, with home in sight, with the journey nearly complete, his paranoid secrecy had cost them everything. Ithaca vanished over the horizon. Weeks of sailing were undone in an instant. And Odysseus's first response was not self-examination, but fury at the men he had failed to trust. The ships limped away from Aeolus's island with no divine assistance. Whatever route home existed now, they would have to find it themselves. They found instead the Laestrygonians. The harbor seemed perfect, a narrow entrance opening into a calm bay surrounded by cliffs. 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships rowed in and moored together, grateful for shelter after weeks of desperate sailing. Odysseus anchored outside. He never explained why. The Odyssey simply notes that he kept his own vessel at the harbor's mouth while the rest of the fleet gathered within. When the Laestrygonians attacked, his ship was the only one that escaped. What happened in that harbor was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Laestrygonians were giants, or so the survivors claimed. They stood on the cliffs and hurled boulders down onto the trapped ships. They speared the drowning men like fish. They carried the bodies away for food, the screaming victims still alive as they disappeared into the hills. 11 ships, perhaps 500 men, gone in minutes, and Odysseus rowed away. He did not attempt rescue. He did not try to provide covering fire or distraction for other vessels to escape. He cut his mooring line and fled while his fleet died behind him. The screams of his men followed him out to sea. He sailed until he could not hear them anymore. One ship remained. Perhaps 45 men of the original 600, and these survivors now knew something they could not unknow. When disaster struck, their captain saved himself. The ancient sources do not question Odysseus's choice. Flight was reasonable. Staying would have meant death, but the nagging detail remains. He anchored outside the harbor. He alone was positioned to escape. Did some instinct warn him? Did he suspect danger and fail to warn the others? Or had years of survival taught him to always leave himself an exit, regardless of what happened to those who trusted him? We will never know. The dead kept no records. The living had reasons to shape the story in their favor. What we know is this. Odysseus arrived at the next island with one ship and a crew who had watched him abandon their companions. Whatever loyalty they still felt was mixed now with something else. Fear, perhaps. The recognition that they were not comrades to their captain but resources. Useful while useful, expendable when not. The next island was Aea, home of the witch Circe. Circe transformed men into pigs. This is the famous image, the sorceress with her wand, the sailors degraded into swine. But the deeper transformation happened to Odysseus himself, and it was entirely voluntary. He stayed on her island for a year. His men begged him to leave. They wept and pleaded, reminding him of home, of Penelope, of the son who was growing up without a father. Odysseus refused. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, and still he remained in Circe's bed while his crew despaired. This was not enchantment. Homer is explicit that Circe released her magic, restored the transformed men, and became a generous host. Odysseus stayed because he wanted to stay. After the horrors of the journey, after Polyphemus and the Laestrygonians, after watching hundreds die, he found a place of comfort and refused to leave it. His men did not have that luxury. They were guests in a witch's house, forbidden to leave without their captain, watching their futures drain away in an endless present of feasting and ease. For Odysseus, Aea was paradise. For them, it was a gilded prison. When they finally convinced him to depart, Circe provided crucial assistance. She told him he must visit the land of the dead to consult the prophet Tiresias. She gave him detailed instructions for the journey ahead. She warned him of the dangers to come, the sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of the sun. She also told him something else, something Odysseus kept to himself. Tiresias's prophecy was explicit. If the crew ate the cattle of the sun god, they would all die. Only Odysseus would survive. He would reach home alone, on a foreign ship, to find his household in chaos. Odysseus heard this prophecy. He understood what it meant, and he chose not to share the full truth with his men. He warned them about the cattle, yes. He made them swear oaths not to touch the sacred herds, but he did not tell them that their deaths were prophesied, that the gods had already written their fates, that every mile they sailed was bringing them closer to destruction. Perhaps he thought concealment was kinder. Perhaps he hoped the prophecy could be avoided, or perhaps he had learned after years of blood that men who know they are doomed do not row willingly toward their doom. He needed them to row. He needed their strength and their obedience for a little while longer. The truth could wait until it no longer mattered. One ship, 45 men, a captain with a secret. The next destination was the land of the dead. The strait was narrow, the water churning between two impossible dangers. On one side, Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed ships whole. On the other, Scylla, a creature with 6 heads, each capable of plucking a man from the deck. Circe had explained the choice clearly. Charybdis would destroy the entire ship. Scylla would take 6 men, but the vessel would survive. There was no third option. There was no clever trick, no wooden horse, no blinding stake, just mathematics. Odysseus chose Scylla. He did not tell his crew. He armed himself and stood at the prow, watching for the monster, but he did not warn the rowers what was coming. Circe had advised this too. She said that panic would slow them down, that knowing would not save anyone, that 6 deaths were inevitable. So Odysseus watched in silence as 6 of his men were lifted screaming into the air. He heard them call his name. He saw them reach for him as the mouths closed around their bodies. He had calculated their deaths in advance and decided the calculation was acceptable. This is what Odysseus called leadership. In the aftermath, he would describe this as one of the most pitiable sights he had ever seen. He would claim it haunted him. But he had made the choice with clear eyes, weighing 6 lives against 40, and he had not even granted those 6 men the dignity of knowing they had been selected for sacrifice. The ship passed through the strait. Scylla retreated to her cliff. 39 men remained, pulling oars that were wet with their companions' blood, sailing toward an island they had been forbidden to approach, the island of the sun. They should have passed it by. Odysseus knew this. Tiresias had been explicit. Circe had reinforced the warning, and Odysseus himself had made his crew swear not to touch the sacred cattle. But his men were exhausted, traumatized, starving. They demanded rest. Odysseus relented. He made them swear again not to touch the herds. He watched them beach the ship and make camp. Then contrary winds trapped them on the island for a month, and the provisions ran out, and Odysseus went inland to pray for guidance. While he prayed, his men broke their oath. Eurylochus, his second in command, made the argument that convinced them. Better to die at sea with full bellies than to starve on a beach. The gods might forgive them. Odysseus might save them somehow. And even if death was certain, at least they would face it having tasted meat one last time. They slaughtered the cattle of the sun. When Odysseus returned, the deed was done. He raged at them, but rage changed nothing. The sun god demanded vengeance from Zeus. The ship was allowed to sail. Then lightning struck. The vessel shattered. The men drowned. Odysseus alone clung to the wreckage, alone with a prophecy fulfilled. 7 years passed on Calypso's island. 7 years of imprisonment or paradise, depending on which version Odysseus told. When he finally reached Ithaca, he came as a beggar, filthy, unrecognizable, testing everyone he met before revealing himself. This was not caution. This was not wisdom. This was a man who trusted no one, who assumed betrayal was universal, who could not simply walk into his own home and embrace his family. He found what he expected to find: suitors occupying his hall, eating his food, pressuring his wife. For 3 years, Penelope had held them off with tricks of her own, weaving and unweaving, promising and delaying. She had remained faithful. His son had grown into a young man searching for his father. His household had resisted as best they could, but Odysseus saw only enemies. The slaughter that followed was not justice. It was massacre. 108 suitors died in the great hall, most of them young men guilty of nothing worse than ambitious courtship. Yes, they had abused hospitality. Yes, some had plotted against Telemachus. But Odysseus made no distinctions. He killed them all. Then he killed the servants. 12 women who had slept with suitors were hanged in the courtyard. They were slaves, human property with no power to refuse their master's guests. Their crime was survival in a household without protection. Their punishment was strangulation, their bodies left hanging as an example. The poet Telemachus, Odysseus's son, carried out this execution. His father had taught him well. One more death remained. Melanthius, a goatherd who had sided with the suitors, was dragged into the courtyard and mutilated. His nose and ears were cut off. His hands and feet were severed. His genitals were torn out and fed to dogs. Then they left him to die slowly in the dirt. This was homecoming. This was the reunion we are supposed to celebrate. Odysseus stood in his own hall, ankle-deep in blood, surrounded by corpses, and called himself restored. He had his wife back. his son beside him, his kingdom reclaimed. The cost was merely 600 men, 10 years of wandering, and a massacre that stained his floors with the blood of boys and slave women. The ancient Greeks did not call this tragedy. They called it victory. What remains when the story ends? Odysseus lived on, according to various sources. He appeased Poseidon with sacrifices. He ruled Ithaca in peace. He died eventually, some say by his own son's hand. Telegonus, born to Circe, arriving unknowing and killing his father in a final irony. But those 600 men remained dead. Their names were never recorded. Homer gave us Elpenor, who fell from Circe's roof in a drunken stupor. One name out of 600, and that one preserved only for comic effect. The rest vanished into the silence that swallows all who die for other men's ambitions. They had homes once, families, lives that mattered to someone. They followed their king to Troy because kings commanded and subjects obeyed. They fought for 10 years in a war over one man's stolen wife. They survived that war only to die in caves and harbors, in whirlpools and storms, in the senseless violence of a captain who could not stop making enemies. Odysseus called himself cursed by the gods. He said Poseidon hated him, that divine malice explained his suffering. But the pattern of that suffering tells a different story. At Ismarus, he chose to raid. At the Cyclops' cave, he chose to stay. At the edge of Ithaca, he chose secrecy over trust. At the narrow strait, he chose 6 men for death. At every turning point, Odysseus made decisions that benefited himself at others' expense, and when those decisions led to disaster, he found someone else to blame. The gods did not kill his men. His pride did. His greed did. His pathological inability to share power or information or risk did. We call him a hero because he survived, because the story is told from his perspective, because 3,000 years of literature have taught us that survival equals virtue and death equals failure. But survival is not morality. Endurance is not goodness. A man who walks away from every disaster he creates is not blessed. He is simply ruthless enough to outlast his victims. The dead cannot tell their stories. The Cicones cannot explain what it felt like to wake to Greek swords. The sailors cannot describe their last moments in Scylla's mouths. The hanged women cannot testify to their innocence. Only Odysseus speaks. Only Odysseus is remembered. This is how atrocity becomes legend. This is how killers become kings. This is how we learn to admire the wrong men, to celebrate the wrong virtues, to mistake cunning for wisdom and survival for heroism. The truth has waited 3,000 years. Now you know it.